Last year, I led a poetry workshop at a retreat in the mountains of Spain. An intimate group of mainly women sat with me in a circle on the floor as we discussed the voice of the heart and why oftentimes we choose to ignore it. I'm not sure if it was the beauty of the surroundings or the chance they had to express themselves in a safe space, but throughout the workshop, I noticed the participants were constantly crying. They cried for themselves, they cried with each other, and cried when listening to the poetry that was written, and it was very beautiful. Afterwards, someone was describing my workshop to one of her friends and said, "You should really do Sukina's poetry workshop. It's like the cheapest form of therapy ever." Her comment made me smile. Maybe it's because I love vulnerability in poetry. Maybe it's because I love raw emotions in words. Maybe it's because we live in a world where we are bombarded with words, many of which lack depth and meaning. So if people can leave my workshop with the confidence to speak from their hearts, then I feel like my work here on planet Earth is being fulfilled. My name is Sukina. I am a hip-hop and spoken word artist. And sometimes I leak words in the color of verses. And with my pen, it feels like I'm painting my purpose, but still only skimming the surface. Sometimes these words come to visit and dance near my fingertips, aching to be known and waiting to live upon my tongue's tip, and I don't resist. In fact, I surrender to a power bigger than me. Sometimes I hold the pen, but my poems write me love letters to help me love better, and soul speak unfettered. The first time I used the written word as a form of release was as a teen, not so many years ago. I had met the guy of my dreams at a local carnival, and I was certain he was the one. Then one day, nothing. He stopped returning my calls, he stopped responding to my texts. I was angry, confused, pissed off, and I was heartbroken. So I decided to write him a letter. I allowed my words to flow, and I really used them to describe exactly how I was feeling. And I noticed in this process, the pain was dimming. It wasn't even about him anymore. It was about me finding a way to express myself and release pain. And this is literally where my journey began. A few years later, I set up a group with my best friend called Poetic Pilgrimage. Voila. And together, we inhabit the realms of hip-hop and spoken word. And through these art forms, I learned the power that comes from molding words into rhymes and breathing life into them. We wrote because it was part of our disposition, part of our genetic makeup, if you will. We wrote because being without the means to express ourselves is like being without the means to breathe. I write because sometimes my heart overflows and I have no choice but to share it. Now, well, it sounds a little bit like I'm a bit unlucky in love, right? All of these breakups and all these different things. But another time I wrote a poem after a very painful breakup. And in this poem, I decided to do something different. I really chose not to immortalize myself as a victim, but as the victor. I used my words to narrate my way out of pain and into empowerment. And I noticed every time I read my poem, I felt strengthened, and I felt the warmth of healing take place all over again. Now, I don't think I'm sharing anything particularly profound here. There is therapeutic benefits in poetry or releasing or writing, but this year, these ideas that I took for granted were challenged. In the spring, I worked on a project with the KVS Theatre in Brussels called Rise Up. This project was designed with the intention of using poetry as a tool for dialogue and healing 1 year after the terror attacks that took place in the city. We wanted to bring together the different people who call Brussels their home so they could get to know one another, but more importantly, hear one another through poems. Terror leaves a stench on a city, a cold breath and an ache and a weight that impacts everybody. But oftentimes we are unaware of how different communities cope. We forget that everyone is trying to heal in the aftermath of an attack. As a Muslim woman, I have no words to convey how I feel when a terror attack takes place in my city. The anxiety that rushes through my body, the fear that shadows me, the strength I require just to leave my house, the backlash I expect. Not only am I a mourner, I am also treated like a suspect because people assume I'm connected to those who wage terror. This reality made it even more important for me to do a project to bring people together. Now, this was the first time I worked on a project where the word healing was in the branding. A Brussels news report covered one of my workshops and said, "Sukina thinks that people can be healed through her poetry workshop." The hint of sarcasm made me kind of mindful of something I always took for granted, that poetry can heal. Poetry can heal, right? Right, everyone believes that. But for some reason, I lacked confidence in a way. I was like, can my workshops really heal? How do I measure healing? How do I know? What am I even trying to heal people from? It was really confusing. Anyway, I continued to do workshops with Moroccan women over pancakes and mint tea. I did workshops with teenage refugees from Afghanistan, Albania, and Syria. I worked with high school kids and also with young kids from a local youth club who were super talented. But the workshop that really changed my life is a workshop I did with asylum seekers, people without papers, or sans-papiers as they are called in Brussels. That workshop is the reason why this talk is not a statement about the healing power of poetry, but a question: does poetry have the power to heal? And I want to tell you a bit about that experience for you to understand really why I'm posing it as a question and not making a statement. So I did a workshop with around 20 people. Most were from North and West Africa. Most had no legal documentation, which meant they had no status in this country. Most hadn't seen their family and even their children for many years. They felt invisible, insignificant, and irrelevant in society. There was one man at my workshop who was particularly agitated. He kept interrupting me, not in a disrespectful way, but because he had a lot to say. I could see the emotion and frustration in his eyes, and he would constantly say to me, Madame, can I read you a poem? I asked the group to do a simple writing exercise, to write for 5 minutes, whatever came to mind. But after a few moments, this gentleman walked out of the room, threw his pen and paper on the table and said, "This is too emotional. This is too painful." I was worried because the workshop hadn't even started yet. I hadn't even begun to take them on a journey to find that voice within. He came back a few moments later and said to me, "How is it possible for anyone to feel what I'm going through? How can anyone possibly feel my pain through poetry?" Well, I said, I personally think it is possible to feel another person's pain through poetry. Even though our lives may differ, as human beings, we all experience the same basic emotions: anger, fear, happiness, sadness, love. We've all experienced rejection, and we all want to be loved. So even though I'm not in your shoes, I can feel something of what you may be going through. He seemed satisfied with my answer, but it was less about my answer and more about the asker. It was more about him. Why did he even ask me that question in the first place? What must he be going through? How must it feel to feel as though no one feels you? I can't imagine. I think about my own life. I literally can't sleep if I have something on my chest. It literally feels like I'm being suffocated if I can't express myself. And I've been known on more than one occasion to wake my husband up in the middle of the night and be like, "Babe, are you awake?" Knowing that he's totally not awake, but knowing that he's awake now, "We really need to talk now." Totally uncool, I know, but now, it made me think about what it means to be able to stand on a stage like this and know that people will listen to you, to be able to speak to a loved one and know that you're being heard. It made me think about the privilege of being a poet, that you literally spend your life just listening to your heart to extract art and knowing that you have an audience. So many people have no audience. Then he asked me another question. He said, "What are we supposed to do now that you've come and opened us up?" His question literally hit me like a lightning bolt in my chest. I had no idea what to even think or say. It really made me question, do poetry workshops heal, or am I just here opening old wounds? But no, I definitely do believe there is healing power in poetry. So this is what I said to him. I didn't say it as eloquently as this, by the way, but it's going to sound eloquent right now. So I said the first stage is identifying and acknowledging the pain. Knowing there's something wrong and choosing not to ignore it is the first stage of healing. The second stage is finding words to articulate your emotions. Trying to use words like colors to paint a picture is the next stage of your healing process. The third stage is actually creating a poem from your experience. Poetry is art. It contains beauty, rhythm, metaphor, imagery, flow. Poetry to me is a beautiful outcome from a painful situation. I actually see poetry like alchemy, converting lead into gold or water into wine, sorrow into stanzas, paint onto pages. To me, that's what poetry can do. The next stage is sharing your poetry. I believe that there is healing in breathing life into your words and allowing them to fly. When your words stand in the light, you realize they don't belong to you. They come through you, but they belong to whoever is listening. Writing your poem is the inhale. Sharing your poem is the exhale, and there is healing in the exhale. Final stage is witnessing others relate to your words. The healing in this stage comes from the fact that sometimes we think we're alone. But when you release your poems and you share them, you realize that there are other people who go through exactly the same thing. You being strong enough and confident enough to share your story gives other people the opportunity to share their own. Now, the workshop ended with some beautiful and powerful poems. And I have no doubt that there was benefit in this workshop and all of the other workshops to follow. But I couldn't help feeling like I hadn't done enough. His words kept ringing in my head. What do we do now that you've come and opened us up? In answer to my own question, I definitely believe there is healing in the power and the process of writing poems. But for different groups, it just requires different approaches. It's not as simple as me walking in for a 2-hour workshop and expecting everybody to expose everything for the sake of art. For some, it takes time. For most, it takes trust. We are all a collection of the stories we tell. And what brings us together is the stories we tell to each other and the spaces in which we share them, and the trust we develop with those who will hold our stories in their hearts forever. I write poems to make myself weep, to rip my heart open so they can receive lessons from heaven and breathe truth. And in truth, I'm just trying to have conversations with God in these poems. Sometimes it feels like all I've got is these poems. So with nothing, save a few tender words upon a page, I introduce my heart to world and stage. Poetry in my breath, I guess that's just the way I'm made. Poetry in my heart, I guess that's just the way I'm made. Thank you very much.